It was a crisp autumn morning when Thomas pulled into the gravel driveway of the old farmhouse. The place hadn't changed much in all these years. The paint on the house was still peeling, and the fence around the yard looked like it could barely hold itself together. But it wasn't the house that Thomas was interested in. It was who was inside. He stepped out of his truck onto the driveway, the crunch of gravel beneath his boots announcing his approach as he made his way up to the front porch. His heart raced with excitement. Today was the day he would finally see Buddy again. Buddy, the retired war dog who had been his companion for 3 tours overseas. They were inseparable, in danger together, and always having each other's backs. But when Thomas was discharged, the facts of life had pulled them apart. Buddy had been adopted by a farmer in this small, sleepy town, and now years later, Thomas had finally tracked him down. Thomas took a deep breath and knocked on the door. There was some movement from inside, and without much ado, the creaky door opened to reveal a middle-aged man with a weathered face and kind eyes, clad in a flannel shirt and smelling of fatigue and friendliness. "Can I help you?" the man asked in a hoarse tone but not unkindly. "Yes, sir," Thomas said, straightening himself up. "My name's Thomas. I was Buddy's handler back when he served in the military. I heard he was here, and well, I was hoping I might be able to see him." The farmer's eyes crinkled slightly, and he nodded, stepping aside to let Thomas in. "Of course, come on in. I'm Henry. Buddy's out back in the yard. Been a good dog, he has. Though he's slowed down a bit over the years." Thomas stepped inside and was immediately hit with the warmth from the fireplace. The house smelled of old wood and something savory cooking in the kitchen. Henry led him through a small living room and out the back door. A large fenced yard lay stretched out before them. And there, lying lazily in the sun, was Buddy. Though Ma's heart leapt at the sight of his old friend, the German shepherd's coat had grayed around his muzzle, and he looked older, more worn, but still every bit the loyal companion Thomas remembered. He whistled softly, the way he used to when they were on missions together. Buddy's ears perked up, and his head came up, his eyes locking on to Thomas. For a moment, there was no recognition, just a cautious gaze. Thomas took another step forward, his voice low and gentle. "Hey, Buddy. It's me, pal. It's Thomas." Buddy slowly got to his feet, his eyes narrowing as he studied the man before him. There was a tension in the air, a feeling that something was off. Thomas felt a pang of worry. Had Buddy forgotten him? He took another step forward, his hand outstretched. In an instant, Buddy's demeanor changed. His ears fell, and he let out a low growl, showing his teeth. Thomas was frozen, his heart racing. This was not the reaction he expected. Buddy had always been gentle with him, always trusted him. But now, it was as if he was looking at a stranger. "Easy does it, Buddy," Thomas said, his tone smooth, attempting to screen out the advancing apprehension. Henry, who had been standing on the porch, stepped forward, his face a mask of concern. "He's been a little jumpy around strangers lately," Henry called out. "Maybe he just needs a minute." Thomas nodded, his gaze never leaving Buddy's face. He knew better than to make any sudden movements. He had seen Buddy in action before, knew what the dog was capable of when he felt threatened. Yet this was a little different. This was Buddy not knowing him, not trusting him. And that seemed to cut just a little too deep for Thomas. "It's okay, boy," Thomas said softly, taking another careful step forward. "It's me. Remember all those nights out in the desert? Just you and me, watching the stars?" Buddy's growl gentled somewhat, and his head cocked to one side, as if trying to place the memory. Thomas hazarded crouching, making himself smaller, less of a threat. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn-out ball, a toy Buddy had loved when they were deployed. He held it out, his eyes never leaving Buddy's. Buddy's ears perked up again, and his gaze went to the ball. He took a tentative step forward, his nose twitching as he sniffed the air. Thomas felt a flicker of hope. His heart pounded in his chest as Buddy took one slow step closer. The growling faded into a whine as he sniffed the ball, then Thomas' hand. "That's it, boy," Thomas said softly, barely audible. It's me. I'm not gonna hurt you. Time seemed to stand still for a moment. Buddy's eyes locked onto Thomas, and for a second, there was a flicker of recognition, a spark that brought back all the memories they had shared, the missions, the dangers, the quiet comfort. Buddy let out a low whine, then, without warning, launched himself forward, not in attack, but in joy. He knocked Thomas backward, his tail furiously wagging as he licked Thomas' face, a series of happy barks escaping him. Thomas laughed, his eyes stinging with tears as he wrapped his arms around Buddy, holding him close. I missed you too, pal, he whispered, his voice hoarse with emotion. Henry watched from the porch, a smile stretching across his face. Looks like he remembers you after all, he called out, his voice filled with warmth. Thomas looked up, placing his hand on Buddy's back as the dog lay down beside him. Yeah, he said with a very soft voice. I think he does. But just as the moment seemed to settle, there was a sudden noise, a rustling from the far side of the yard. Buddy's ears perked up, and he let out a low growl, his eyes narrowing as he stared in the direction of the sound. Thomas turned, his body tensing. He knew that growl. It wasn't the cautious growl Buddy had given him, it was a warning. Henry frowned and stepped down from the porch. Probably just a raccoon, he said, but his voice had an edge to it, a slight uncertainty. Thomas rose to his feet, his eyes scanning the tree line at the edge of the yard. The rustling grew louder, and suddenly, a figure emerged, a man, dressed in dark clothing, his face partially obscured by a hood. He moved quickly, his eyes darting around as if he was looking for something. Buddy's growl deepened, and without hesitation, he planted himself before Thomas, body tense, ready to protect. Thomas felt his heartbeat quicken as his training kicked in, his senses on high alert. The man didn't look like he fit in, and the way he moved, furtive, nervous, set off every alarm bell in Thomas' mind. Hey! Thomas called out, his voice sharp. Who are you? What are you doing here? The man froze, his head snapping up as he spotted Thomas and Buddy. For a split second, there was something almost like panic in his eyes, before he turned and made a run for it, bolting toward the tree line. Buddy barked, ready to give chase. Thomas held him back, but his eyes were narrowed on the place where the man had disappeared into the woods. Henry ran up, his face pale. What in the world was that about? He asked, his voice shaky. Thomas shook his head, eyes still on the tree line. I don't know, he said, voice low. But something tells me that guy wasn't just passing through. He looked down at Buddy, who was still staring intently at the spot where the man had disappeared. Thomas laid a hand on the dog's head. His jaw was set in determination. Looks like we've got some work to do, old friend, he murmured. Buddy let out a low bark, his eyes locking with Thomas in an expression of acknowledgement. It was as if he knew that whatever happened, they were in it together. Just like old times. The next morning, Thomas awoke to find his unease still clinging to him. He had spent the night on Henry's couch, at Henry's insistence, but also because Thomas wished to keep an eye on things. Something didn't quite sit right with him regarding the man they had seen in the yard. The way he moved, that look of panic in his eyes, all spoke to something more than a common intruder. Buddy had slept at his side, the dog's presence a comforting reminder of the bond they had shared. Now, with the early light of the sun filtering in through the curtains, Thomas looked down at Buddy, already awake beneath him, his eyes watchful, his ears alert. You ready to get to work, boy? Thomas asked in a whisper. Buddy let out a gentle bark and his tail wagged slightly. Thomas smiled and leaned forward, giving the dog a light pat on the head, then got up. He stretched, wincing as his muscles protested the movement, and then went to the kitchen, where Henry was already up frying eggs and bacon. Mornin', Henry said over his shoulder, eyes tired but affable. Figured you could use a good breakfast. Thomas nodded, a grin of gratitude on his face. Thanks, Henry. Appreciate you letting me crash here. Henry waved a hand dismissively. No trouble at all. Besides, after what happened last night, I think it's better you stick around for a bit. Something about that fella didn't seem right. Thomas nodded in agreement, his expression now serious. That's what I'm thinking, too. He wasn't just some passerby looking for nothing. He was searching for something. Henry placed a plate of eggs and bacon before Thomas, furrowing his brow. What do you think he was after? Thomas let out a sigh, shaking his head. I don't know. But I think Buddy and I are gonna take a look around today. See if we can find any clues. Henry nodded, his face etched with concern. You be careful out there. I don't like the idea of someone sneaking around my property. Thomas gave him a reassuring smile. Don't worry, Henry. Well, be careful. The two of them went out into the yard after breakfast. The air was cool that morning, and leaves crunched beneath their feet as they walked to the place where they had seen the man the night before. Buddy's nose was to the ground, sniffing intently, his ears up and moving back and forth, searching for any scent that might give them a clue. Thomas watched Buddy work, his eyes scanning the tree line. Over the years, he had learned to trust Buddy's instincts. The dog had a knack for finding those things that others might miss. As Buddy drew closer to the edge of the yard, his posture changed. His ears went back, and he let out a low growl, his body tensed up. What is it, boy? Thomas asked, moving closer. Buddy led him to a place near the fence, his nose pointing to something on the ground. Thomas crouched down as his eyes narrowed into a gaze, where a little piece of fabric was caught on the fence, dark, almost black, and torn. He picked it up, examining it closely. It really looked like it might be from the man's attire. Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. This wasn't some random trespasser. Whoever it was had been close enough to get caught on the fence, and that meant they had been trying to get in or out of the property in a hurry. He stuffed the cloth into his pocket, and then stood, surveying the area again. There was something more here, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. He looked down at Buddy, who was still sniffing the ground, his tail rigid, his body alert. Let's see if we can follow the trail, Thomas said, his voice low. Buddy let out a low woof, and they began moving along the fence line, Buddy in the lead, his nose near the ground. They walked through the trees, underbrush thick, the ground uneven. Thomas kept his eyes open, senses highly alert. Conventional years in situations like this, and he knew better than to let his guard down. They walked for roughly 20 minutes until Buddy suddenly stopped in his tracks. His head snapped up, his ears perked. Thomas froze, too, his eyes following where Buddy was staring. There, in the distance, partially concealed by the trees, sat a small, makeshift camp-out tent, barely visible with a small fire pit beside it. Though Ma's heart was racing as he crouched low, gesturing for Buddy to be quiet. He watched the camp for a moment longer, trying to decide if anyone was there. The tent was huddled and looked abandoned, the fire pit cold, but there was no telling if the man from the night before was still around. Thomas circled in slowly, Buddy right at his side. The dog was low and quiet. As they reached the edge of the camp, Thomas could see that it was a hastily prepared setup, a few supplies scattered on the ground, a sleeping bag inside the tent, and a backpack leaning against a tree. He approached the backpack carefully, unzipping it and peering inside. What he found made his blood run cold. Inside the backpack were detailed maps of the area, with Henry's farmhouse circled in red. There were notes in the margins, dates and times, and a few photographs of the farmhouse taken from a distance. Thomas felt a knot form in his stomach. This wasn't just some random trespasser. This was someone who had been planning something, someone who had been watching them. He looked at Buddy, who was staring at him intently, and in the dog's eyes he saw knowledge. Thomas knew immediately what it meant. Whatever the reason this man had for being here, Thomas knew it was not good. Thomas took a deep breath. His mind was racing. He needed to get back to the farmhouse and show Henry what he had found. They needed to be prepared whatever was coming, it wasn't over yet. He zipped up the knapsack and slung it over his shoulder, motioning for Buddy to follow. They moved quickly but cautiously, back through the woods towards the farmhouse. Emerging from the trees, Thomas could see Henry standing on the porch, his face etched with concern. "Find anything?" Henry hollered as they approached. Thomas nodded, his face grim. "We need to talk, Henry." Inside. Henry's face paled, and he stepped aside, allowing Thomas and Buddy into the house. Once inside, Thomas set the backpack on the kitchen table, unzipping it and laying out the contents for Henry to see. The older man's eyes widened as he took in the maps, the photographs, the notes. "What in the world?" Henry muttered, his voice shaking. "Why would someone be watching us?" Thomas shook his head, clenching his jaw. "I don't know, but whoever this is, they've been planning something. And we need to be ready." Henry turned to Thomas with fear-filled eyes. "What do we do now?" Thomas took a deep breath, his eyes flipping down to Buddy, who sat beside him, his eyes keen. "We prepare. We don't know what this guy is after, but we're not gonna let him catch us off guard." Henry nodded firmly. "All right. Anything you need, Thomas?" "I'm with you." Thomas gave him a resolute nod. "We'll get through this, Henry. Buddy and I have faced worse. We'll figure out who this guy is and what he wants." He looked down at Buddy, giving the dog a reassuring pat on the head. "Just like old times, right, pal?" Buddy let out a soft woof, his eyes never leaving Thomas. It was as if he comprehended the gravity of the situation, as though he knew that they were in this together just like they had always been. A pre-dawn Thomas, beelining it in his head with thoughts of the maps, the photographs, and a kind of impending doom hanging in the air over them like a storm cloud, knew they couldn't afford to sit back and wait for whatever was coming. They needed answers, and they needed them fast. Henry was already in the kitchen when Thomas walked in, a pot of coffee brewing on the counter. He looked up, his eyes meeting Thomas with a mix of fear and determination. "Morning," Henry said, his voice rough with exhaustion. "Didn't sleep much?" "Me either," Thomas replied, as he poured some coffee in a cup. He turned to Buddy, who was lying near the door, his eyes open, alert, as if expecting something. "We need to find out who this guy is and why he is watching your place." Henry nodded solemnly. "I agree. But how do we do that? We don't even know where to start." Thomas sipped from his coffee, thinking of all the ways it might go. "I think we need to take a closer look at those notes. There might be something we missed, something that could tell us more about who this guy is." Henry nodded, and they laid the maps and notes out on the kitchen table together. Thomas started with the photographs, his eyes squinting as he tried to let angles and location from which they were taken sink in. This man had been watching the farmhouse for some time. There were morning, afternoon, and evening shots, from other locations along the tree line. "He's been planning this for a while," Thomas said, his voice low. "These aren't just random pictures. He's been studying the place, watching for patterns." Henry's face paled, and he swallowed hard. "But why? What could he possibly want from me?" Thomas shook his head, his eyes coursing the notes that had been scribbled in the margins of the maps. Most of the notes were cryptic, times, dates, locations, but one word kept appearing, circled multiple times: shipment. Thomas pointed at the word, furrowing his brow. "Shipment." He wrote it down over and over again. "You have any idea what that might mean?" Henry's eyes widened, and he shook his head slowly. "No. I'm just a farmer. I don't deal with shipments of anything, at least not anything unusual." Thomas scowled, his mind racing. There was something they were missing, something that did not add up. He looked over at Buddy, who watched them intently, the dog ears perked up. "Whatever it is, it's important to him. Important enough that he's willing to sneak around and watch your place for days, maybe even weeks." Henry rubbed a hand over his face, his expression weary. "What do we do, Thomas? We can't just sit here and wait for him to come back." Thomas nodded, his jaw set. "You're right. We need to be proactive. I think the best thing we can do is head into town, see if anyone has noticed anything unusual, any strangers asking questions, anyone acting suspicious. Maybe someone has seen this guy." Henry nodded, his eyes filled with resolution. "All right. Let's do it." They loaded up in Henry's old truck, Buddy sitting in the back, his head out the window as they lumbered into town. The sun had just started to rise, casting a golden glow over the small, sleepy town. Thomas couldn't help but feel a sense of urgency as they drove down the streets. Time was running out, and they needed answers before it was too late. They first made a stop at the local diner, a small, cozy place where it seemed everyone knew everyone else. Henry led the way inside, nodding to a few familiar faces as they made their way to the counter. A middle-aged waitress with a friendly smile greeted them. "Morning, Henry, what can I get you today?" Henry gave her a tight smile. "Actually, we're not here for breakfast, Mary. We're looking for some information. Have you seen any strangers around lately? Anyone asking questions about my place or acting suspicious?" Mary's smile tailed off and her brow furrowed into a frown. "Well, now that you mention it. There was a man in here a few days ago. Kept mostly to himself, just sitting in the corner, but he was asking some strange questions. Wanted to know about the farms around here, who owned what land. I thought it was peculiar at the time, but I didn't think much of it." Thomas leaned forward, his heart racing. "What did he look like?" Mary hesitated, squinting as she tried to remember. "Tall, thin. Wore a dark jacket, had a bit of a scruffy beard. Didn't catch his name, but he had this this way about him. Made me uneasy." Thomas exchanged a look with Henry. Sounded just like the man they had caught sight of in the yard. "Anything else he said? Anything at all to let on what he wanted?" Mary shook her head, her face a mask of apology. "No, nothing. He asked about the farms and then was gone. Haven't seen him since." Thomas nodded. Small consolation, but at least it confirmed that the man had been in the vicinity, asking questions. He thanked Mary, and they left the diner, back out to the truck. "What now?" Henry asked. There was an edge to his voice. Thomas took a deep breath, scanning the street. "We just keep asking. Somebody knows something." They spent the next few hours going from place to place, the hardware store, the feed store, even the gas station, asking any resident if they had seen the man. Most hadn't seen anything out of the ordinary, but a few of them mentioned seeing a man who fit his general description, always alone, always watching. As they walked back to the farmhouse, Thomas' imagination grew worse. Whatever this man was, he was being too careful and not leaving any trail. And that made him even more dangerous. When they returned to the farmhouse, he could see that Buddy was still on high alert, scanning the tree line with his eyes as they got out of the truck. Thomas knew they couldn't let their guard down, not for 1 second. "We need to set up some kind of security," Thomas said as they walked up to the house. "This guy isn't going to stop, and we need to be ready for him." Henry nodded, his face pale but determined. "What do you have in mind?" Thomas looked around the estate, his mind racing with possibilities. Well-placed cameras. Perhaps a few motion sensors will be in order. I know a friend in security who might help with the equipment. We'll do watches at night, too. One of us will be awake at all times, keeping watch. Henry swallowed hard, his eyes full of concern. "You really think it's going to come to that?" Thomas met his gaze, his face deadpan serious. "I hope not. But we can't take any chances. Whoever this guy is, he's dangerous. And we're not going to let him catch us off guard." Henry nodded, his jaw set in determination. "All right. Let's do it. Whatever it takes." Thomas gave him a reassuring pat on the shoulder. "We'll get through this, Henry. I promise." He looked down at Buddy, who was standing by his side, his eyes filled with loyalty and determination. Thomas knew that no matter what happened, he could count on Buddy. They had faced worse together, and had come out stronger on the other side. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Thomas and Henry set to work. They installed cameras around the perimeter of the property, placing them in strategic locations where they could get a clear view of the yard and the tree line. Thomas' friend had come through, providing them with motion sensors and even a couple of floodlights that they set up near the barn. By the time they were done, the farmhouse was locked down as tightly as it could be. Thomas stepped out onto the porch, eyes scanning the darkness gathering in the yard, his senses on high alert. He knew this wasn't anywhere close to over, that whoever had been watching them would return. He also knew they were prepared now. They wouldn't be ambushed again. Henry came out onto the porch, a cup of coffee in his hand. He handed one to Thomas, his eyes scanning the yard. "Thank you, Thomas. For everything." Thomas took the cup, giving Henry a nod. "We're in this together, Henry. Well, get through it." Henry sighed, his gaze distant. "I just don't understand why. Why would someone go to all this trouble? What do they want?" Thomas shook his head, the grinding of his molars audible. "I don't know. But we're going to find out. And when we do, well, make sure they don't get what they're after." Buddy let out a low woof, his ears perked up as he watched the tree line. Thomas looked at him, a surge of pride swelling in his chest. "You hear that, boy? We're gonna get through this. Just like old times." Buddy's tail wagged, eyes fixed on the shadows at the edge of the yard. Thomas knew that whatsoever was waiting ahead, they were going to face it together. And they were going to win. Night had fallen over the farmhouse, and the darkness seemed to press in from all sides. The security lights cast long shadows across the yard, and the cameras stood in place, their red lights blinking in the dim light. Inside, the house was quiet. Thomas and Henry sat in the living room, their eyes fixed on the monitors they had set up on the table. The feeds from the cameras showed different angles of the yard, the barn, and the tree line. Buddy lay at Thomas' feet, his ears perked up, his eyes alert. There was a tension in the air, a feeling that something was coming, something inevitable. Thomas could feel it deep in his bones, and he knew Buddy could too. Henry looked at Thomas, his face pale but set. "How much longer do you think we'll have to wait?" Thomas shook his head, his eyes never leaving the screens. "I don't know. But if this guy is as determined as I think he is, he'll make a move soon. He knows we're onto him, and that makes him dangerous." Henry swallowed hard, his hands shaking a little as he sipped his coffee. "I just want this to be over, Thomas. I want my life back." Thomas looked at Henry, his face softening. "I know. And we will get there, Henry. We only need to stay focused. Buddy and I have been through worse. We can handle this." In an instant, Buddy's head snapped up, ears going rigid. A growl low in his throat, his eyes were fixed on the front door. Thomas' heart skipped a beat as he turned toward the monitors, his eyes scanning the feeds for any sign of movement. There, on the camera which faced the tree line, a shadow moved, slipping between the trees. Thomas tensed, his voice low. "Henry, he's here." Henry's eyes widened, and he set his coffee cup down, his hands trembling. "What do we do?" Thomas stood, his movements slow and deliberate. "Stay calm. We stick to the plan. I'll head outside, see if I can get eyes on him. You stay here, keep an eye on the cameras. If you see anything at all, you let me know." Henry nodded, his face pale. "Be careful, Thomas." Thomas nodded reassuringly at him, then turned to Buddy. "Come on, boy. Time to go to work." Buddy stood, stiff, his gaze riveted on Thomas. Together they sidled to the front door. Thomas stopped and listened a moment. The night was still. The only sound was that of the wind rustling leaves far away. He took a deep breath, then slowly opened the door and stepped out onto the porch. The cool night air hit him, and he scanned the yard, his eyes adjusting to the darkness. Buddy was at his side, his ears perked, his nose to the ground. Thomas moved slowly, his eyes darting between the shadows, his senses on high alert. They went down the steps, across the yard, headed toward the tree line where Thomas had seen the shadow. Buddy's body was low to the ground, tense, his growl low as they neared the edge of the woods. Thomas' heart was beating in his chest, the adrenaline coursing through his veins. Buddy stopped suddenly, his growl deepening. Thomas froze, peering hard into the darkness. There, just a few feet away, he saw him, the man from the photographs, his dark jacket blending in with the shadows. He crouched near the fence, staring intently at the farmhouse, oblivious to Thomas and Buddy closing in on him. Thomas stepped forward, his voice low and even. "Hey! What are you doing in here?" The man jerked, head snapping up, his eyes wide with surprise. For a moment, there was a flicker of panic in his eyes, and then he was off, turning and sprinting deeper into the woods. Buddy let out a bark, ready to give chase, but Thomas held him back, his eyes narrowing. "Easy, Buddy," Thomas said calmly. "We don't know what we're up against just yet." He watched the man disappear into the darkness, listened as his footsteps faded. Thomas took a deep breath, his jaw clenched. He knew they couldn't let this guy get away, not when they were so close to finding out what he was after. He turned back to the farmhouse, his eyes locking with Buddy's. "Let's go, boy. We need to regroup." Inside the house, Henry was pacing in a circle through the living room, his face carved deep in concern. As he turned and spotted Thomas and Buddy entering, he ran to them, eyes open wide. "What happened? You see him?" Thomas nodded, his face grim. "Yeah, we saw him. He was by the fence, watching the house. But he took off before we could get to him." Henry ran a hand through his hair, his face pale. "What does he want, Thomas? Why won't he just leave us alone?" Thomas shook his head, clenching his jaw. "I don't know. But we're not going to let him intimidate us. He's trying to scare us, trying to make us vulnerable. But we're not going to give him that power." Henry nodded, his eyes in a gleam of resolution. "What do we do now?" Thomas took a deep breath as his mind whirled. "We need to draw him out. He's not going to stop until he gets what he wants, whatever that is. We need to make him think he's got the upper hand, make him come to us." Henry's brow furrowed. "How do we do that?" Thomas glared into the monitors. "We set a trap. Make it look like we let our guard down, that we're not watching anymore. He'll take the bait, and when he does, well, be ready." Henry swallowed hard, his eyes filled with equal parts of fear and hope. "All right. Let's do it. Whatever it takes." The next days were all preparatory. Thomas and Henry worked untiringly, setting a trap as if the sons had abandoned their measures of security. They left the cameras on view but disconnected, the motion sensors turned off. They even made a show of leaving the front door unlocked, as if they were no longer concerned about the threat. But in reality, they were readier than ever. Thomas had set up cameras well out of sight, and he put Buddy on high alert. The dog never left his side. They took shifts sleeping, each keeping watch through the night, waiting for an exact moment when the man would make his move. And then, on the third night, it happened. Thomas sat in the living room, the lights off and Buddy at his feet. Henry was in the kitchen, trying to act busy, when Buddy let out that low growl. Though Ma's heart fluttered as he looked over at the monitor hidden from view, his eyes narrowing since it showed a shadow across the yard, heading in the general direction of the house. "He's here," Thomas whispered in a low tone. Henry turned to him, his face pale, but he nodded, his hands steady as he reached for the radio they had set up to communicate. Thomas motioned for Buddy to stay quiet, his eyes locked on the monitor as the figure moved closer, slipping through the yard and up to the front porch. The man hesitated for a moment, his hand hovering over the doorknob, and then he pushed the door open, stepping inside. Thomas felt his muscles tense, his heart pounding in his ears. He waited, his breath held, as the man moved deeper into the house, his footsteps barely audible on the wooden floor. And then, in one swift motion, Thomas sprang into action. He stepped out from his hiding spot, his voice commanding. "Stop right there!" The man froze, his eyes wide with shock. Buddy let out a deep, menacing growl, his teeth bared as he positioned himself between Thomas and the intruder. The man looked around, his face pale, his eyes darting between Thomas and Buddy. "Who are you?" Thomas asked firmly. "What do you want?" He made no reply, his eyes wide with fear. He took a backward step, but a sharp bark from Buddy, which reverberated across the house, froze him in place. Henry stepped forward into the room, his face a mixture of fear and anger. "Why have you been watching us? What are you after?" The man swallowed hard, his hands trembling. I was just following orders," he stammered, his voice barely a whisper. Thomas' eyes narrowed. "Orders? From who?" The man hesitated, his eyes darting towards the door as if considering making a run for it. But Buddy let out another growl, and he seemed to think better of it. I can't. They'll kill me if I talk. Thomas stepped a step forward, his voice low and dangerous. You will very soon wish you had started talking. Who are you working for? What do they want? The man took a fearful glance at Thomas. For a moment, it seemed like he might not say a word, but then his shoulders dropped, and he exhaled shakily. Okay. I'll talk. Just don't let that dog near me. Thomas let his gaze shift to Buddy before returning it to the man. Now, talk. The man took a deep breath, his eyes darting between Thomas and Henry. It's about a shipment. They think you've got something valuable. I don't know what it is, but they want it, and they sent me to find out where it is. Henry's face paled, and he shook his head. Shipment? I don't know anything about a shipment. I'm just a farmer. The man looked at Henry, his expression desperate. They think you're hiding something. Something that was supposed to come through here. They won't stop until they find it. Thomas felt a cold chill run down his spine. Whoever these people were, they were serious. And they weren't going to stop until they got what they wanted. He looked at Henry, then back at the man. Who are they? Who sent you? The man shook his head, frightened, his eyes wide. I can't. They'll kill me. Thomas took a step forward, his eyes locked on the man's. You're more afraid of them than you are of me? Trust me, that's a mistake. The man swallowed hard, his eyes darting to Buddy, who was still growling, his teeth bared. Finally, he seemed to break. All right. It's a group, a syndicate. They deal in stolen goods, black market stuff. They thought something valuable was being shipped through here, and they think you have it. I swear, that's all I know. Thomas cast a glance across the table at Henry, his jaw tight. It was bigger than they had initially thought, much bigger. Whatever kind of people these were, they were organized and very dangerous. Yet Thomas knew this for certain. They would not be intimidated by such people. They were going to fight, and they were going to win. He looked at the man, his eyes cold. You're going to help us. You're going to tell us everything you know, and then you're going to help us stop them. The man's eyes widened, and he shook his head. No, I can't, Thomas cut him off, his voice icy calm. You don't have a choice. You can either help us or take your chances with them. What's it going to be? The man hesitated, then nodded, defeat written across his shoulders. A light. I'll help you. Just don't let them find me. Thomas nodded, his eyes never leaving the man's face. You made the right choice. Now let's get to work.